Cole Harrington dropped his hand onto the old black man's shoulder flat, uninvited, the weight of someone who had never once asked permission, and leaned down slow. "Hey, brother, I think you're lost. The kitchen staff entrance is around back. They don't usually let the help sit up front." A few people laughed. Quietly, relieved someone else said it first. Marcus Webb didn't move, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the hand or the man attached to it, so Harrington pushed further louder for the tables nearby. No badge, no uniform, no name tag. You'd think a $2.3 million security system would have caught that at the door. Or maybe they just figured who's gonna say anything, right? Then he pulled up a chair, sat down, uninvited voice, dropping to something worse than loud. A black man in a Macy's blazer at a flag officer table. "Do yourself a favor, finish your water, walk out the front door. Nobody has to make this bigger than it needs to be." He tapped the table twice, stood up, walked away like the matter was settled. Marcus looked up for the first time. No anger, no hurt. Just a look that made Harrington want to step back without knowing why. Because what Cole Harrington didn't know, what nobody in that ballroom had figured out, yet the four-star generals pulling up outside had one unspoken rule whenever Marcus Webb entered a room. You stop, you stand, you salute. Stay with this story, because what happens next will leave every soul in that ballroom completely frozen. Drop your location and local time in the comments. And if you're new here, don't go anywhere. You will not want to miss how this ends. The Meridian Grand Hotel Ballroom had been built for exactly this kind of night. 40-foot ceilings draped in American flags and soft gold light. 6 crystal chandeliers throwing fractured brilliance across 320 guests, who had between them authorized more military operations than most countries had conducted in their entire histories. The annual Joint Forces Leadership Gala, invitation only, security verified, egos mandatory. The room smelled like polished brass, expensive cologne, and the particular brand of ambition that only exists within driving distance of the Pentagon. Generals in olive and dark blue dress uniforms stood near the open bar in clusters, speaking in the clipped shorthand of men who had spent careers turning small talk into strategy. Admirals in white and gold moved between tables with the practiced ease of people who had navigated far more dangerous waters than a ballroom. Senators in charcoal suits that cost more than a staff sergeant's monthly salary smiled too wide and shook hands too long. Defense contractors, men who had never worn a uniform but had profited enormously from the people who did, circulated the room with the smooth confidence of those who understood that money in the right rooms outranked everything. Every chest carried ribbons, every lapel carried stars or pins, or the quiet arrogance of someone who had sent others into fire and slept without difficulty afterward. And at the entrance, mostly unnoticed by the guests flowing past them, stood 2 Marine sentries in full dress uniform, motionless, precise, carved from discipline and duty. The hotel had installed a biometric verification system specifically for this event. Fingerprint scanners at each entrance point, a $2.3 million security apparatus custom-fitted into the Meridian Grand's lobby and corridors over the preceding 3 days. Every guest had been pre-registered, every identity confirmed before they crossed the threshold. It was by any measure an impenetrable room. Lieutenant Cole Harrington had walked between every table in it twice already, and nobody had said a word. He was 27 years old, 6'1" jaw like something drawn by a recruiting artist, and dressed in navy dress whites, so clean they seemed to generate their own light beneath the chandeliers. Above his left breast pocket sat a gold trident, the seal insignia, the thing that made colonels pause mid-sentence and civilians stare just a half-second too long. Harrington touched it every few minutes, not from nervousness, from habit, from the deep reflexive need to confirm it was still there, still real, still saying everything he needed it to say about who he was and what he had survived to become. He had earned it. 3 years of his life, 2 friends buried. Sleep he would never fully recover. He had paid the price in full, and he intended to collect on it for the rest of his career. His crew orbited him like satellites, locked in comfortable rotation. Danny Price stood to his right. Stocky, sunburned, a voice like gravel scraping concrete. The kind of man who laughed first and thought later, and had built an entire personality around amplifying whoever he stood next to. To Harrington's left, Ryan Sellers leaned against a marble pillar with a glass of club soda and the expression of a man running quiet calculations nobody had asked him to run. Ryan had been silent most of the evening, more silent than usual. His eyes kept drifting toward table 11, then away again, the rhythm of someone who had noticed something he hadn't yet decided what to do with. They were decorated. They were battle-tested. They were on this particular evening deeply bored. Bored men with tridents and open bars were rarely a safe combination. Marcus Webb sat at table 11. He had arrived at 7:43 p.m., 17 minutes before the doors officially opened to general guests, and had been shown to his seat by a junior events coordinator, who had checked his name against a list, nodded once, and disappeared without ceremony. He had sat down, ordered water, and not moved since. 58 years old. Broad-shouldered but not imposing in the way that announces itself. Dark skin, close-cropped silver at his temples, hands that had the particular steadiness of someone who had learned long ago that stillness was not the absence of strength, but its most disciplined expression. His blazer was navy blue, no insignia, no name tag, no ribbons, no decoration of any kind. In a room where every surface was covered in the visual language of rank and achievement, Marcus Webb was a blank page. To Ryan Sellers, something about that blankness felt significant in a way he couldn't articulate. To Danny Price, it was Tuesday. To Cole Harrington, it was an invitation. The $2.3 million biometric system had confirmed Marcus Webb's identity at 7:41 p.m. It had cross-referenced his credentials against 3 separate federal databases, returned a clearance level that caused the system's junior monitoring technician to lean forward in his chair and read the screen again, and then logged the entry without comment, because that was what systems did. They recorded. They verified. They did not explain. The technician had stared at the clearance level for a long moment. Then he had gone back to his coffee. None of this information had made its way to Cole Harrington. It would eventually, but not in any way he was going to enjoy. Harrington finished his first whiskey, started his second, and let his eyes settle on the man at table 11 for the 3rd time in 20 minutes. No uniform, no badge, no escort. In a room operating under 3-star security protocols, at a table reserved for flag officers, sitting with the unshakable composure of someone who did not need the room to confirm his right to be in it. That bothered Harrington in a place he didn't fully understand. He handed his empty glass to Danny without looking away from table 11. Danny grinned. "Don't." Harrington was already moving. Ryan Sellers watched him go. Set his club soda down on the pillar's edge. Exhaled slowly through his nose. He had a feeling this evening was about to become something none of them had planned for. He was right. He just didn't know yet how completely right he was. Harrington came back from table 11, wearing the expression of a man who had just proven something. He dropped into his seat, picked up his second whiskey, and recounted the exchange to Danny with the energy of someone debriefing a successful operation. The dismissal, the shoulder, the 3-point ultimatum delivered low and clean across the tablecloth. He made it sound surgical. He made it sound necessary. Danny laughed loud enough to draw glances from the nearest table. "You actually said Macy's blazer." "I said exactly that." And he just sat there, didn't say a word. Danny shook his head, still grinning. "Man's got nerve, I'll give him that." Ryan said nothing. He was looking toward table 11 again, that same quiet, measuring look he'd been wearing all evening. Marcus Webb hadn't moved, hadn't flagged a waiter, hadn't reached for his phone, hadn't looked around the room for someone to rescue him, or validate him, or confirm that he was allowed to be there. He just sat. Still. Absolute. Like a man who had been still in far more difficult places than this and had learned that stillness deployed correctly was the most unnerving thing you could do to someone who needed you to react. That bothered Ryan more than he wanted to admit. "Harrington," he said quietly, "leave it alone." "I did leave it alone." "You did the opposite of leaving it alone." I asked a reasonable question in a room with 3-star security protocols. "If that's a crime, arrest me." Harrington took a long pull of whiskey. "He's still there." So nobody checked him. Nobody asked him to move. Nobody did anything. He set his glass down with slightly more force than necessary. "In a room like this, with the people in this room, that's not normal." Ryan opened his mouth, closed it, looked back toward table 11. He was right that it wasn't normal. He was drawing the completely wrong conclusion from that fact. But he had learned over 3 years of serving alongside Cole Harrington that there were moments where words didn't reach, and this was becoming one of them. Harrington stood up. This time, he didn't go alone. Danny followed, half curiosity, half the gravitational pull of someone who had never once in his life let a scene develop without inserting himself into it. Ryan stayed behind, arms crossed, watching with the expression of a man who already knew how the next 10 minutes ended and deeply wished he didn't. Marcus saw them coming. He didn't tense, didn't shift, didn't adjust his posture in any of the small, involuntary ways that betrayed awareness. He simply moved his water glass 2 inches to the left, the quiet, habitual gesture of a man clearing space on a desk before sitting down to work. Harrington pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without asking. The legs scraped across the marble floor, a sound that turned 4 nearby heads. Danny positioned himself, standing behind Harrington's right shoulder, pulled out his phone and held it at his side. Casual, angled upward, recording. "This is gonna be good," Danny murmured just loud enough for the nearest table to hear. A woman at that table, mid-40s army dress uniform, sharp eyes that had spent 14 years cataloging exactly this kind of behavior, looked at Danny's phone, looked at Marcus. Said nothing yet. But her expression shifted in the particular moment of someone opening a new file in their memory. Harrington leaned forward, elbows on the table, close enough that Marcus could have counted the campaign ribbons on his chest. "So here's what I keep coming back to," Harrington said. Voice conversational, tone anything but. "Everyone in this room has clearance. Everyone has a branch. Everyone has something on their chest that tells the rest of us who they are and what they've done." He paused. "You've got nothing, and that bothers me." Marcus looked at him. "Does it?" Not a question, a statement, delivered so flatly it had the effect of a door closing. Harrington pressed forward. "It does, because this table is reserved for flag officers, and flag officers don't show up to the Joint Forces Gala without a uniform, without a badge, without anyone who can vouch for them." He tilted his head. "So I'm going to ask you one more time, and I'd appreciate a straight answer. Who are you and what are you doing at this table?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that has texture, weight. "Why does it matter to you, Lieutenant?" "Because I earned my place in this room." Harrington's hand moved to his trident, that same unconscious reach, that same reflexive confirmation. "This cost me everything. 3 years of my 20s I'll never see again. 2 friends I'll never talk to again. His voice hardened on those last words. The truest thing he'd said all evening. And I don't sit easily with the idea that someone is in this room who hasn't paid anything at all. Marcus let the words settle. Then you think everyone who belongs in a room like this paid the same price as you? I think everyone who belongs here paid a price. That's a fair position. Marcus nodded slowly. Let me ask you something, Lieutenant. Harrington blinked. He had expected deflection. Silence. Maybe an admission. He had not expected a question. When you came to this table the first time tonight, Marcus said, his voice unhurried, precise, each word placed like a measured step. You put your hand on my shoulder without asking. You suggested I belonged in the kitchen. You looked at a black man in a room full of decorated officers and saw someone who needed to be removed. He paused. Did you do that because you genuinely believed it was a security concern? Or did you do it because you looked at me and made a decision before I said a single word? The table went completely silent. Danny's phone hand dropped 2 inches. The color left his face in stages. Harrington opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Somewhere behind them, a waiter dropped a fork. The small sound cracked through the silence like a starting pistol. People at the 4 nearest tables were watching now, not turning their chairs, not making it obvious. But conversations had dimmed, and eyes had shifted, and the particular quality of attention in the room had changed in the way it changes when something real is happening, and everyone can feel it, but nobody wants to be the first to say so. Harrington stood. The chair scraped marble louder this time. I don't know who you are, he said lower now, but I know what I see. Marcus looked up at him, and for the first time that evening something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not hurt. Something closer to the expression you wear when you watch someone walk toward a cliff they can't see, and you've already decided that some lessons cannot be taught, only experienced. You should go back to your friends, Lieutenant, he said quietly, before you make this worse than it already is. Harrington stared at him for 3 full seconds, then straightened his collar, turned, and walked back toward the bar without another word. His hands were shaking. He couldn't figure out why. Brigadier General Howard Vance found him on the terrace at 8:31 p.m. Marcus was standing at the stone railing, looking out at the Potomac, the way a man looks at something he has earned the right to look at, without urgency, without performance, with the deep and unhurried attention of someone who has spent enough of his life in motion to genuinely appreciate stillness. The night air was cool for October. The river moved below them dark and slow, carrying the city's reflection in long broken ribbons of gold and white. Somewhere inside, the string quartet had started playing again. Vance could hear it faintly through the glass doors. Something classical, unhurried, designed to suggest that everyone inside was more civilized than they actually were. He stepped up beside Marcus and didn't say anything for a moment. They had served together long enough that silence between them was never awkward. It was just another form of communication, the kind developed by people who had been in enough situations where words were either impossible or inadequate. I heard what happened in there, Vance said finally. Word travels fast. It's a room full of intelligence officers. Word is the only thing that moves faster than ego. He paused. You all right? I'm fine, Howard. You're out here counting the lights on the Potomac instead of in there counting stars on shoulders. That's your version of not fine. Marcus almost smiled. Almost. He called me the help in front of 4 tables of decorated officers, and then he sat down across from me uninvited and told me. He stopped. Let the sentence finish itself in the night air. He told me to finish my water and use the front door, like he was doing me a courtesy. Vance exhaled slowly. The kind of exhale that carries a lot of weight without making any sound. 26 years, Marcus said. Not bitterly. Just as a fact, the way you state facts that have simply accumulated beyond the point where emotion does them justice. 3 combat tours, Fallujah, Ramadi, the Korangal Valley, 191 missions over 11 years of active deployment, 4 years writing force protection policy that kept operators alive on missions they'll never know I had a hand in. He paused, and a 27-year-old lieutenant looks at me and sees a man who snuck in through the wrong door. Vance didn't respond immediately. He had learned over many years that when Marcus Webb was talking, the right thing to do was let him finish. You remember Fallujah? Marcus asked. 2005. The convoy ambush on Route Mobile. Vance stiffened slightly. I remember. I pulled 2 Marines out of a burning Humvee that day. Dislocated my shoulder on the second one. Burns on both forearms. I still have the scars. He looked down at his hands briefly, then back at the river. When the medevac finally landed, the crew chief, 6 weeks in country, maybe 22 years old, looked at me standing there with fire on my boots and shrapnel in my left arm and said, "Sir, I think you should let someone else handle this one." Marcus paused. He was looking right at me when he said it, Howard. Not at my rank, not at my injuries, at me. What did you do? I put the Marine I was carrying into the helicopter. Then I got in after him because the landing zone was not secure, and someone needed to make that call. He turned to face Vance. The terrace light caught his eyes, steady, dark, containing something that had been compressed by decades of exactly this kind of experience into something harder and quieter than anger. The crew chief I dealt with through proper channels later. Filed the report myself. Vance made a sound low somewhere between a laugh and the recognition of something that can't be laughed at. The sound of a man who had spent 30 years in service and understood at a cellular level the weight of what he had just heard. That kid in there, Marcus said. Harrington. He doesn't know who I am. Nobody in that room knows who you are tonight. That was the point. Marcus turned back to the river. I've been doing this for years, Howard. Showing up without the uniform, without the detail, without the constellation of indicators that tells people how to treat me. I sit in the back of briefings at bases I nominally command and watch how the room operates when nobody important appears to be watching. He paused. It's how I found the procurement irregularities at Fort Bragg, how I identified the command climate problem at Naval Station Mayport, how I figured out which general officers lead with service and which ones lead with fear. Tonight was supposed to be observation. Tonight was supposed to be observation. Harrington made it something else. Marcus was quiet for a moment. His father served under my command. Norfolk, 2009. Petty Officer First Class James Harrington. Logistics Support Mediterranean Rotation. He let that sit. Good man, quiet, showed up every day, did the work, never needed anyone to confirm his value out loud. Vance raised his eyebrows. You're serious? I authorized the Trident deployment his son's team ran 2 years ago. Cole Harrington has that pin on his chest partly because of a signature with my name on it. He picked up his water glass from the railing where he'd set it when he came outside. Held it up briefly against the city lights. Which makes this entire evening considerably more interesting. His phone buzzed once in his breast pocket. He set the glass down, retrieved it, read the screen. A single message from a number saved under no name. Motorcade ET, a 6 minutes. Marcus slipped the phone back into his pocket. Picked up his water glass again. Took a slow, deliberate sip. You should go back inside, Howard. Vance studied him, the sharp jaw, the steady hands, the absolute composure of a man who had been underestimated so many times across so many decades that he had long since finished being surprised by it and had begun instead to use it. What are you going to do? Vance asked. Nothing. Marcus set the glass down on the railing with a sound so quiet it barely registered. In about 6 minutes, the room is going to figure it out on its own. He turned and walked back toward the glass doors. At the threshold, he paused, looked back over his shoulder. Howard? Yeah, James Harrington, the father. Good man. Never needed a room to know his name to do his job right. He held Vance's gaze for exactly 1 second. I hope the son learns what the father already knew. Then he stepped through the doors and back into the light. Vance stood alone on the terrace for a long moment. He looked out at the Potomac, took a slow breath of October air. Then he picked up his bourbon from the railing where he'd left it, shook his head once and said quietly to no one at all, God help that boy. Harrington was on his 4th whiskey when the performance began in earnest. Not that he would have called it a performance. In his mind, he was making a point. A reasonable, necessary, security-conscious point that everyone else in the room was too polished or too cautious to make themselves. That was how it felt from the inside, like clarity, like courage, like the same instinct that had carried him through BUD/S and 3 combat deployments was now operating in a ballroom, identifying a problem and refusing to look away from it. From the outside, it looked considerably different. He had drifted back toward the center of the room, whiskey in hand, and begun talking at a volume calibrated for an audience rather than a conversation. 4 tables within range, maybe 30 people. Enough. I'm just saying, he started the classic opening of a man who has already decided what he's going to say and is using the preamble to gather witnesses. We have protocols. This isn't a neighborhood bar. This is the Joint Forces Leadership Gala. 3-star security, verified guest list, biometric entry. And we're all just going to sit here while a man with no credentials, no rank insignia, no branch affiliation, and no visible reason to be at a flag officer table just sits there, undisturbed, all evening. Danny nodded along the loyal amplifier, scanning the nearby tables to measure the response. Ryan Sellers stood very still with his arms crossed, and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the room, the expression of a man trying to physically separate himself from a situation while remaining geographically inside it. Colonel Angela Trent heard every word. She was seated 2 tables over Army dress uniform, 14 years of service behind her eyes, and 2 published reports on toxic command culture in her professional record. She had the particular skill developed over a decade of watching men like Harrington operate in institutional spaces, of being able to assess a situation completely without appearing to pay attention to it. Oh, she set her wine glass down. Noted the phone in Danny Price's hand still angled and recording. Noted the 30 people in earshot. Noted the junior officers at the near tables who were doing the math on whether to intervene and calculating incorrectly that the cost was too high. She turned in her chair. Lieutenant, she said. Quiet, direct, the voice of someone accustomed to not needing volume to be heard. Lower the volume, please. Harrington looked at her, registered the rank, made the calculation that career officers pray their subordinates never make, and decided in the warm confidence of his 4th whiskey that he had a point worth finishing. With respect, Colonel, I'm raising a legitimate concern about you're raising your voice at a formal gala about a man who hasn't spoken to you. Trent's expression did not change. That's not a security concern. That's a grievance. There's a difference. And in my experience, officers who can't tell the difference between the two tend to find themselves explaining that confusion to a review board. The table nearest to Trent went completely silent. Harrington opened his mouth, then closed it. Then made the second terrible decision of the evening, which was to dismiss the warning and continue. All I'm saying is that I've served this country in 4 combat theaters. I've buried friends. I've bled for this uniform. His voice had taken on the particular quality of a man performing sincerity rather than feeling it slightly too loud, slightly too deliberate. And I think that earns me the right to ask questions about who belongs in a room like this. At the table directly beside him, a man in a charcoal suit, Thomas Keller, defense contractor, net worth $47 million, 0 days of military service, nodded slowly and leaned toward the woman beside him. "Kid's got a point," Keller murmured, just loud enough to carry. "You can't just walk in off the street." Thomas Keller had never worn a uniform in his life. He had, however, spent 20 years selling the people who wore them a category of drone component that had been cited in 3 separate Pentagon efficiency reviews as overpriced by a factor of 4. He was in the specific way of men who profit from other people's sacrifice without sharing any of it, entirely comfortable rendering judgment about who had earned the right to stand in rooms built on that sacrifice. Ryan Sellers heard it. His jaw tightened. Danny heard it and grinned the validation of an outside voice joining the chorus. Marcus Webb, visible from where they stood, had not moved, had not reacted, had not done anything that acknowledged the performance happening 30 feet away from him. He sat with the absolute stillness of a man who had been the subject of rooms like this before and had long since learned that the most devastating response was no response at all. That stillness somehow made Harrington louder. "I have bled for this country," he said, volume climbing now the whiskey and the audience and the untouched composure of the man at table 11 combining into something he had lost the ability to modulate. "I have buried friends for this flag, and I will not sit quietly while someone who hasn't paid a single day of that price sits at a table reserved for the people who have." Ryan grabbed his arm. "Sit down, Cole." Harrington pulled free. "Why?" "Because some man I've never heard of might be uncomfortable." "No." Ryan's voice dropped to something flat and final. "Because you're not protecting this room. You're just protecting your ego. And everyone here can see the difference except you." It was the most Ryan Sellers had said all evening. Harrington stared at him. Something flickered behind his eyes, a recognition brief and unwelcome that was immediately buried under everything else. He turned back to his audience, and then the hotel manager appeared at table 11. 41 years old, dark vest, practiced smile, the careful demeanor of a hospitality professional, trained to resolve problems without causing scenes. He leaned down beside Marcus Webb and spoke in a lowered voice that was nonetheless audible to the 3 nearest tables. "Sir, I apologize for the interruption. We've received a concern that your name may not appear on our verified guest list for this evening. Would you be able to provide some identification?" The room did not gasp. It did something worse. It noticed. In a ballroom containing 320 guests, not one other person had been asked for identification that evening. Not the senators. Not the contractors, not the junior officers who had arrived without escorts, not the +1s in evening gowns who had never set foot on a military base in their Levtses, only Marcus Webb. Seated quietly. Having said almost nothing. Having done nothing except exist in a room that had decided through some collective unspoken calculus that his presence required explanation. Marcus reached into his breast pocket, removed a credentials case, placed it on the white tablecloth with the same unhurried precision he brought to every movement, opened it flat. The manager looked down. The color left his face with remarkable speed. Sir, I sincerely apologize. I had absolutely no idea." "I know you didn't," Marcus said. 4 words. No anger, no edge. Just a statement of fact delivered with the particular exhaustion of a man who has said the same thing in different rooms more times than he has ever bothered to count. The manager straightened, retreated, disappeared back into the staff corridor with the hunched posture of a man who understood fully and too late the magnitude of what he had just done. Marcus closed the credentials case, returned it to his pocket, picked up his water glass. Somewhere behind a pillar near the east wall, he permitted himself one slow breath. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't need to read it. He already knew what it said. Marcus checked his phone at 9:09 p.m. The message was 4 words. Motorcade ETA 4 minutes. He slipped the phone back into his breast pocket, picked up his water glass, and allowed himself the smallest possible smile, the kind that lived entirely in the muscles around the mouth and communicated nothing to anyone who might be watching. 4 minutes. He had waited longer in worse places. In the ballroom behind him, Cole Harrington was still talking. Marcus could hear it without turning around, the particular cadence of a man who had crossed from making a point into needing an audience, the slight elevation in volume that betrayed the difference between conviction and performance. He had heard that cadence before. In briefing rooms, in command meetings, in the spaces where institutional power concentrated and the people closest to it mistook proximity for ownership. He thought briefly of the night he had sat in a Senate confirmation hearing 7 years ago, the third chair from the left. The only black man at the table fielding questions from a subcommittee that had already decided. In the way that subcommittees sometimes do, that extraordinary qualifications in the wrong body required more scrutiny than ordinary qualifications in the right one. A senator from a state Marcus had deployed to protect had leaned into his microphone and asked with genuine puzzlement whether Marcus felt his background had adequately prepared him for the responsibilities of the position. Marcus had looked at the senator for a long moment. Then he had answered the question with the patience of a man who had answered versions of it his entire life, and the precision of a man who had long since learned that patience and precision deployed together were more devastating than anger. Senator, I've been preparing for this position since the first time someone told me I wasn't prepared for the room I was already in. I've been doing it my whole career. At this point, I'd say I'm overqualified for the question. The subcommittee had gone very quiet. He had been confirmed by a margin of 81-19. He had never mentioned that evening in an interview. Back in the present, the sound of Harrington's voice rose another half register. Marcus glanced toward the ballroom without fully turning. Through the gap between the pillar and the wall, he could see Colonel Trent at her table posture, straight wineglass down the expression of a woman, filing information away with the efficiency of a system built for exactly this purpose. He recognized the expression. He had worn it himself in different rooms for different reasons. He made a mental note about Trent, the good kind. Then the hotel manager had appeared at table 11, and Marcus had watched from the terrace doorway as the man bent down to speak, and he had felt something that was not quite anger and not quite exhaustion, but lived in the space between them, the specific emotional weight of a moment that was entirely unsurprising and entirely unacceptable at the same time. That particular combination. He had carried it since he was 19 years old. He suspected he would carry it until he died. I know you didn't. 4 words. Everything he had left to say on the subject. He checked his watch. 9:11 p.m. 2 minutes. Inside the ballroom, Harrington had finally stopped talking. The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence of resolution, but the dense, pressurized silence of a room that had absorbed too much and was waiting to see what happened next. Danny Price had put his phone away finally, belatedly, about 40 minutes too late for it to matter. Ryan Sellers had moved several feet to the left, the physical manifestation of a man putting distance between himself and a decision he had failed to prevent. Colonel Trent picked up her wineglass, took one slow, deliberate sip, set it back down. Thomas Keller, the contractor in the charcoal suit, was now deeply involved in a conversation with the person on his right about something that had nothing to do with anything that had just happened. The speed of his disengagement was impressive. Men like Keller had spent careers developing that particular skill. At 9:12 p.m., the string quartet in the far corner finished their piece and paused between movements. In that pause, that brief, natural silence between one song and the next, the entire ballroom seemed to draw a single collective breath. And then the two Marine sentries at the main entrance, who had stood in motionless parade rest for the preceding 2 hours and 14 minutes, moved simultaneously. Their heels came together with a crack that traveled across 40 feet of marble floor like a report from a starting pistol. Every head within 30 feet turned. Every conversation within 40 feet stopped mid-sentence, mid-word, mid-thought. A senator put down his glass. The contractor stopped lying. The string quartet did not begin their next piece. The silence that descended on the Meridian Grand Ballroom at 9:12 p.m. on a Tuesday evening in October was not the silence of a room at rest. It was the silence of 320 people recognizing simultaneously and instinctively that something was about to happen that would reorder their understanding of everything that had occurred in the preceding 2 hours. Cole Harrington felt it before he understood it. A change in the air pressure of the room. A shift in the quality of attention around him, the way a crowd's focus moves from distributed to singular, from casual to absolute. He turned toward the main entrance. The brass handles on the double doors were already moving. Marcus Webb, standing near the east wall, set his water glass down on a passing waiter's tray, with a motion so smooth and unhurried, it was almost invisible. He straightened the front of his blazer with 2 fingers, a single brief adjustment, barely perceptible. Then he clasped his hands in front of him and stood completely still. The doors opened, and Cole Harrington's entire understanding of the evening, of the man at table 11, of the credentials case, of the look that had made him want to step back, without knowing why, began in the space of one breath to come completely apart. General Raymond Okafor walked in first. United States Army. 4 stars. 63 years old. Built like a man who had decided sometime in his 40s that the world would have to come to him because he was done going anywhere. At speed he hadn't chosen. His dress uniform carried decorations that spanned 4 decades of service across 5 continents, compressed into 3 inches of ribbon and metal above his left breast pocket, that represented, if you knew how to read them, a biography more complete than most published memoirs. He moved with the gravity of a man who had commanded 200,000 troops across 3 simultaneous theaters of operation and had learned that the most powerful thing a leader could do in any room was simply to enter it without apology and without performance. Behind him, Admiral Patricia Steele, United States Navy. 4 stars. Silver-haired, lean eyes like polished gunmetal in flat light. She had spent 31 years navigating the precise intersection of institutional power and personal excellence, and the result was a woman who carried herself like a blade, not because she was trying to be intimidating, but because everything unnecessary had been removed a long time ago. She commanded every naval special warfare unit currently in active deployment, every SEAL team, every operator, every trident, including the one on Cole Harrington's chest. Behind her, General David Marsh, Air Force, 4 stars, steady, deliberate, the kind of man whose presence in a room made the room quieter without him saying a word. And finally, General Lewis Carver, United States Marine Corps, hands the size of dinner plates. A face that looked like it had been assembled by committee from a list of requirements that prioritized function over aesthetics. He did not walk into rooms. He occupied them the way weather occupied a landscape, completely without consultation, and with the implicit understanding that everything within his radius was now operating on his terms. 16 stars, 4 careers. The combined institutional authority of 4 officers who had between them shaped the modern American military into what it currently was. The ballroom responded the way ballrooms respond to that concentration of power. People stood. Not all at once in a ripple table by table the way standing ovations begin before anyone has consciously decided to participate. Glasses were set down. Conversations were not paused, but abandoned, entirely left incomplete like evacuated buildings mid-word and mid-thought. The string quartet made no attempt to resume. Even the ambient noise of 320 people existing in a shared space. The clink, the murmur, the background hum of organized social function simply stopped. Cole Harrington stood with everyone else. Pure muscle memory. Every military instinct he possessed pulling him to his feet before his brain had processed the input. He straightened his dress whites. His hand moved to his trident, that same reflexive reach, that same unconscious confirmation. For one full second, standing straight in his clean whites, with his decorations in order, he felt what he always felt when senior brass entered a room. That electric, specific certainty that one day, not today, but one day, men would stand like this when he walked in. That certainty had approximately 90 seconds left to live. General Okafor stepped through the entrance, and his eyes moved across the room with the efficiency of a man who had spent 4 decades reading spaces the way other people read text, fast, comprehensive, missing nothing. He noted the senators, noted the contractors, noted the junior officers at various stages of attention, noted the particular quality of tension in the room that told him something had already happened tonight that he would need to understand. Then his eyes moved to the east wall. He stopped walking. Not a hesitation. Not a pause. A stop, complete, deliberate, the full cessation of forward momentum from a man who did not stop for many things in this world. He had stopped for the President of the United States. He had stopped for the Secretary of Defense. He stopped now for the man standing near the east wall, in a plain navy blazer, with no insignia and no decoration, and no indication of rank beyond the particular quality of stillness that Okafor had learned over 40 years of service to recognize as the most reliable indicator of genuine authority he had ever encountered. General Raymond Okafor drew himself to full height, shoulders back, chin level, right hand rising with the precision of a man who had performed this motion 10,000 times and understood at a level below conscious thought exactly what it meant and exactly when it was required. A full salute. Not the abbreviated social gesture that senior officers sometimes offered at informal events. A complete textbook, boot camp precise salute, the kind that enlisted personnel practiced until their shoulders ached. Mr. Deputy Secretary. His voice was clear and carried without effort across the nearest 40 feet of ballroom. We weren't expecting you this early, sir. The room did not gasp. It went silent in a way that was qualitatively different from the silence that had existed a moment before. Denser, more absolute. The silence of 320 people processing information that rearranged everything they thought they understood about the preceding 2 hours. Admiral Steele saw Okafor's salute and followed without hesitation. Crisp, immediate, no deliberation. General Marsh. Same. General Carver. Same. 4 four-star generals. 16 stars on 8 shoulders. Standing at attention in the Meridian Grand Ballroom, saluting a man in a plain navy blazer who had spent the preceding 2 hours being told in various ways and by various people that he did not belong in the room. Marcus Webb returned the salute with the ease of someone for whom this was not an event, but a Tuesday. At ease, gentlemen. A small nod toward Steele. Patricia. Then taking in all 4 of them. This is a gala, not a formation. Get yourselves a drink. They relaxed. But the damage or the correction, depending on which side of the evening you had spent, was already done and could not be undone. The information moved through the ballroom like voltage through water. Deputy Secretary of Defense, Marcus Webb. third in the civilian chain of command at the Pentagon. Direct authority over every uniformed service member in the room. Direct authority over every general who had just saluted him. Direct authority over every SEAL team, every carrier group, every special operations deployment currently active in any theater anywhere on Earth, including especially, devastatingly, Lieutenant Cole Harrington. Harrington did not move. He could not move. His body had entered the state that the human nervous system reserves for information it cannot immediately process, a complete suspension of voluntary function, a full system pause while the brain attempted to reconcile what it was receiving with everything it had previously understood to be true. His face went white, not pale. White, the color of paper, the color of a man watching the ground disappear beneath him. The whiskey glass in his right hand trembled. A single drop of amber liquid crested the rim, traveled down the outside of the crystal, and reached his thumb. He did not feel it. Danny Price said nothing. His phone was in his pocket. His face had the specific, stricken expression of a man who had been recording something he now desperately wished he hadn't. Ryan Sellers appeared at Harrington's left side. His voice was barely audible. "Don't move," Ryan said. "Don't speak. Don't breathe wrong." Across the ballroom, Colonel Angela Trent lifted her wine glass, took one slow, quiet sip, and allowed herself the smallest smile she had worn in years. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The room said it for her. Marcus Webb took the podium at 9:27 p.m. He did not stride, did not rush, did not carry himself with the particular energy of a man who had just been vindicated in front of 300 people and wanted them to feel the weight of that vindication. He walked to the microphone the way he walked into every room at the pace he had chosen on the timeline he had set, with the complete absence of performance that was itself the most powerful performance in the building. He adjusted the microphone, looked out across the ballroom. 320 faces looked back at him, some with recognition, some with the particular expression of people rapidly reassembling their understanding of the past 2 hours. Some, a small number, seated near the back with the careful blankness of people who had not been close enough to witness the full sequence of events and were now reading the room to understand what they had missed. At the bar, Cole Harrington stood between Danny Price and Ryan Sellers and did not move and did not speak, and did not look at anything except the middle distance approximately 6 inches above Marcus Webb's left shoulder. Marcus let the silence exist for a moment. He was very good at letting silence exist. Then he spoke. "Good evening. For those who don't know me, and I understand that this evening has made clear that some of you don't, my name is Marcus Webb. I serve as Deputy Secretary of Defense." A ripple moved through the room. Not laughter, not applause. Something between recognition and reckoning, distributed unevenly depending on where you had been standing for the last 2 hours. "I wasn't planning to speak tonight," Marcus continued. His voice was unhurried, warm even. There was no edge in it, no architecture of accusation, no subtext engineered to land on any specific lieutenant currently standing near the bar with the color of old chalk. "I came to listen, to observe, to see how this community carries itself when it believes no one of consequence is paying attention." He paused. "I learned a considerable amount." The room absorbed that without responding. The way a room absorbs something it recognizes as true, but hasn't yet decided how to hold. "I want to talk about something simple," Marcus said. "I've been talking about it my whole career in one form or another, and I expect I'll be talking about it long after this evening, is a footnote in everyone's memory." He looked out across the assembled faces, generals, admirals, senators, contractors, junior officers, the full cross-section of American military power dressed in its finest and arranged beneath 6 crystal chandeliers. Dignity, not the kind conferred by rank, Not the kind earned in a classroom or a combat zone, though both of those matter enormously. The kind extended to another human being before you know their name, before you know their title, before you know whether they can do something for you or to you. He let that settle. 10 seconds. 15. Long enough for it to reach the far tables and every conscience that needed reaching. I grew up in Baltimore, he said. My father drove a city bus for 31 years. My mother taught third grade at a public school that had been underfunded for longer than she had been alive. I was the first person in my family to wear a uniform, the first to earn a commission, the first to walk through certain doors. He paused. I walked through most of them twice, once to prove I could, once to hold them open. Colonel Angela Trent stood up. She did it quietly, without announcement, pushing her chair back and rising to her feet in the middle of Marcus's pause. No one had asked her to. There was no signal, no coordination. She simply stood because the moment required it, and she was the kind of officer who recognized when a moment required something and did not wait for permission. 3 seconds later, the officer beside her stood, then the table behind her. By the time Marcus continued speaking, roughly 40 people were on their feet. Not a standing ovation, not yet, not quite. Something more considered, more deliberate. The standing of people who were choosing to be counted. We are the most powerful military institution in human history, Marcus said, and his voice carried now with the particular authority of a man speaking in a room that had decided to listen. Our strength is not in our weapons systems. It is not in our technology, our doctrine, or our budget. It is in our people, and we lose that strength. We lose everything the moment we begin measuring a person's right to be in a room by what they look like rather than what they have done and who they are. He stepped back from the podium. The applause was immediate and sustained and carried the specific intensity of a room trying collectively and somewhat desperately to demonstrate that it had been on the right side of the evening all along. Marcus descended the 3 steps from the stage. General Okafor met him at the bottom with a handshake that became a brief, respectful half-embrace. Admiral Steele was next, then Marsh, then Carver. An informal receiving line that had not been planned or organized, but had formed anyway because 4-star generals understand at an instinctive level when protocol demands itself, regardless of the schedule. Admiral Patricia Steele shook Marcus's hand, held it for 1 extra second, and said something quietly that made Marcus nod once with his eyes closed briefly, the nod of a man receiving something he had not expected. Then Steele released his hand, turned, straightened her uniform, and walked with absolute directional certainty toward the bar, toward Cole Harrington. The distance was 40 feet. Steele covered it in 12 seconds. Harrington saw her coming at 20 feet. His heels came together. His spine went rigid. His chin came up. Every physical instinct he possessed assembled him into the correct configuration before his mind had finished processing what was happening. Lieutenant Harrington. Her voice required no amplification. It never had. Sir, the word came out correctly, automatically, from a place below conscious thought. Outside, now. Danny Price took 1 careful step to the left. Ryan Sellers did not move, did not look at Harrington, did not offer anything, not comfort, not acknowledgement, not the small mercies of a friend standing close when the storm arrives. He simply stood with his arms at his sides and looked straight ahead. Some storms Ryan had learned you did not stand in front of. You stood beside the person after, if they were still standing. Harrington followed Admiral Steele toward the corridor. His footsteps were even. His posture was correct. His hands were still. But the whiskey glass he had set on the bar top before following her out left a perfect ring of condensation on the polished wood. His hands had been shaking when he put it down. Colonel Trent watched him go, finished her wine, set the glass down with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had written 2 reports predicting exactly this outcome in exactly this kind of room and had never once enjoyed being right about it. She picked up her phone and began composing a message. Not about Harrington. About Marcus Webb. There were things worth documenting, and there were things worth documenting for the right reasons. This was both. The hallway outside the Meridian Grand Ballroom was long and marble-floored, and lit by wall sconces that threw soft amber light across portraits of former secretaries of defense, men and women, who had held the office that Marcus Webb now occupied in an acting capacity, who had shaped conflicts and ended them and rebuilt the institutions that made such things possible. It was the kind of hallway that had absorbed a great deal of consequence over the years and had learned to hold it without comment. Admiral Steele stood with her back to the portraits, feet shoulder-width apart, hands clasped behind her. The posture of a woman who had delivered difficult news to people at every level of the institutional hierarchy and had long since stopped adjusting her approach based on the rank of the recipient. Harrington stood at attention, 3 feet in front of her. "Do you understand what you did tonight, Lieutenant?" "Sir, That is not a rhetorical question. I want to hear you say it." Harrington's throat worked. "I disrespected a senior civilian official, sir. You publicly humiliated the Deputy Secretary of Defense in front of 4 combatant commanders, 3 sitting senators, and approximately 300 guests at the highest-profile military social event of the calendar year." Steele's voice did not rise. It had the quality of something precise and very cold. "You questioned his right to be in the room. You implied he entered through deception. You called him the help." She paused. "And your teammate recorded it on his phone." Harrington said nothing. There was nothing to say. "I have commanded naval special warfare for 6 years," Steele continued. "I have seen operators survive things that would end most men. I have also watched decorated operators end their own careers in a single evening because they confused the confidence that made them exceptional in the field with the license to behave without accountability in every other context." She took 1 step closer. "Your trident does not follow you into a ballroom and excuse what you do there. It follows you everywhere and holds you to a higher standard in every room you enter. Do you understand the difference?" "Yes, sir. There will be a formal review. Your commanding officer will be notified by 0800 tomorrow. This incident will be documented in full." She held his gaze for a long moment, not unkindly, but without mercy. "And you will write a formal letter of apology to the Deputy Secretary, handwritten, delivered through my office. Not an email, not a typed document. A letter in your hand that demonstrates you understand what you did and why it was wrong." "Yes, sir." She studied him for 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked back toward the ballroom, footsteps even measured fading down the marble corridor, without hurry or drama. Harrington stood alone. The portraits on the walls looked down at him from their frames. Men and women who had held enormous power and understood most of them. That enormous power required enormous restraint. He looked at them without seeing them. He was looking at something else, at the specific interior landscape of a man whose entire self-understanding had been built on a particular foundation and who was standing in the rubble of that foundation, trying to locate something solid. He was still standing there at 10:09 p.m. when his phone buzzed once. A message from an unfamiliar extension. "Hotel internal line. Room 318. If you want to come now. MW." The knock came at 10:22 p.m. Marcus was at the desk near the window reviewing briefing documents on his tablet. Tomorrow's schedule began at 700. Force readiness numbers. A drone procurement contract that had been bothering him for 3 weeks. The gala had receded into the background of his evening with the efficiency of a man for whom events of this kind were neither the first nor the last of their type. He said, "Come in," without looking up. The door opened. Cole Harrington stepped through, still in his dress whites, still wearing the trident. But the fabric had not changed, and everything underneath it had the specific structural change of a building after the ground has moved. Still standing. Different. He stopped 3 paces from the desk, drew himself to attention, raised his hand in a salute, not the automatic reflexive salute of a man performing a habit, but the salute of a man who had thought about the motion before making it and had chosen to mean it. Marcus looked up, let him hold it for 3 full seconds, then returned it. "Sit down, Lieutenant." Harrington sat. His hands went to his knees. His knuckles were white. Marcus set his tablet down, looked at him with the unhurried attention of a man who had learned that the most important information in any conversation was usually in what wasn't said yet. The silence lasted 30 seconds. Harrington broke first. "Sir, I owe you an apology. What I said tonight at the table and afterward, it was wrong. It was beneath the standard of the uniform I wear and the community I claim to represent. And I am deeply, genuinely sorry." The words came out clean and rehearsed. The apology of a man who had composed it in a marble hallway and edited it carefully, sincere as far as it went. Marcus listened to all of it. Then he said, "Why did you join the Navy?" Harrington blinked. "Sir, it's a straightforward question. Why did you enlist?" The question knocked him sideways in the specific way that simple, direct questions knock people sideways when they have prepared for complexity. He opened his mouth, stopped, started again. "My family didn't have much, sir. Small town outside Richmond. My father was enlisted petty officer first class, 22 years of service. He came home with a bad back and a flag in a shadow box, and not much else." He paused. "I didn't want that. I wanted to be someone the room noticed when I walked in." The words landed in the space between them and stayed there, raw, unscripted. The first honest thing Harrington had said since he sat down at table 11 4 hours ago. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Something behind his eyes shifted, not softening exactly. Recognition. The specific, precise recognition of a man who had heard a version of that sentence in his own voice in a different room a very long time ago. "Your father," Marcus said. "James Harrington." Harrington's head came up. "You knew my father. He served under my command. Norfolk, 2009. Logistics Support Mediterranean Rotation." Marcus leaned back slightly. "There was a night February, a systems failure during a joint exercise 0300, everything going wrong simultaneously. Every officer in that building was scrambling. Your father was the only enlisted man who stayed past his shift without being asked. I found him at 0400, still working. I asked him why he hadn't gone home." Marcus paused. He said, "Somebody has to, sir. Might as well be someone who knows what they're doing." Harrington's eyes were red. Not crying. Not yet. But the pressure was building behind the surface. "He never told me that story," Harrington said quietly. "He wouldn't have." "That's exactly the point." Marcus looked at him steadily. "Your father never needed a room to know his name. He showed up. He did the work. He earned the respect of everyone around him, not because of what he wore, but because of how he carried himself every day, without audience, without applause." He paused. "That is the hardest thing in this profession, Lieutenant, and your father made it look like nothing." Harrington said nothing. He was looking at his hands. "I'm not going to end your career," Marcus said. "Admiral Steele's review will proceed, and the consequences will be what they are. That's non-negotiable, and you know it. But I am not going to make a call that closes a door on you permanently." He paused. Your father earned that grace, and I have to believe his son is capable of becoming what his father already was. He stood, extended his hand. Harrington looked at it for one long moment, then stood and took it. His grip was firm. His hand trembled. One thing, Marcus said, still holding the handshake. Sir, your father never needed anyone to confirm he belonged in the room. He released Harrington's hand. Neither do you. Stop asking for that confirmation by demanding it from everyone else. Harrington nodded. He couldn't speak. He turned, walked to the door, opened it. In the doorway he paused, didn't look back, but his shoulders, which had carried the trident all evening, like a crown, settled into something different. Not the posture of a man performing authority. The posture of a man beginning for the first time to understand what it actually cost. He stepped into the hallway and pulled the door closed behind him. Marcus stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the Potomac. The river moved below, dark and slow and indifferent, the way rivers move when they have been moving longer than anything watching them and expect to be moving long after. He picked up his tablet, returned to the briefing documents. Tomorrow began at 700. 6 months later, Cole Harrington stood on the flight deck of the USS Kearsarge and watched the Mediterranean stretch out in every direction like a gray, endless promise. He was leaner than he had been in October. Not in the way of someone who had stopped eating or started punishing himself, in the way of a man who had stopped performing and started working and discovered that the two activities used entirely different muscles. The kind of weight you lose from the inside out when the things you were carrying for appearance stop being worth the effort. The letter of reprimand was in his permanent service record. It would be there when he made lieutenant commander. If he made lieutenant commander. It would be there at every promotion board, every command review, every evaluation for the remainder of his career, a single documented entry that said, without elaboration, this happened, and it was serious, and he was held accountable. He had not fought it, had not consulted a JAG officer, had not made a single phone call to anyone who might have the institutional standing to soften the outcome. He had read the paperwork signed where he was required to sign and reported to his new assignment aboard the Kearsarge without drama and without the extended farewell from his SEAL team that he had always imagined would accompany a major transition in his career. Ryan Sellers had shaken his hand the morning he left. Firm brief, no speech. Danny Price had not come to see him off. The support role aboard the Kearsarge was not glamorous work. It was not the kind of work that generated citations, or attracted the attention of promotion boards, or gave a man stories to tell at a gala. It was logistics coordination, the 1,000 invisible functions that kept a floating city of 3,000 people operational across extended deployment. It was the work that got done by people like James Harrington, petty officer, first class, 22 years, bad back flag in a shadow box, and it turned out to be considerably more complex and considerably more important than Cole Harrington had understood from the outside. He was good at it. That surprised him more than anything. The men and women on his team noticed the change within the first week. He asked questions instead of issuing declarations. He corrected mistakes with patience instead of performance. When junior sailors struggled, he stayed late without being asked, not because he was required to, not because anyone was watching, but because somebody had to, and he knew what he was doing. He heard his father's voice in that phrase every time it surfaced in his mind, and every time it surfaced, he understood it a little more completely than he had the time before. 2 months into the deployment, a message arrived from Ryan Sellers through the ship's communication system. You're different now. Good different. Don't lose it. Harrington read it 3 times, did not respond, but he did not delete it either. He kept it in a folder on his personal device alongside one other item. A photograph slightly faded at the edges that he had found in a box of his father's belongings the week before he shipped out. He had been looking for something else and had found it by accident, the way the most important things are usually found. His father, James Harrington, standing on a pier at Naval Station Norfolk. Dress uniform. The particular posture of a man who was comfortable in his own skin in a way that required no audience to maintain. Beside him, slightly shorter, wearing the insignia of a rank considerably above the frame's immediate context, was a man perhaps 15 years younger than the version Cole Harrington had met in room 318 of the Meridian Grand Hotel. Marcus Webb. Norfolk, 2009. His father had never mentioned him. Not once. Had never dropped the name at a dinner table, never used the connection to smooth a path for his son's career, never leveraged 17 years of a lapsed relationship into any form of advantage for himself or anyone connected to him. He had simply served, done his work, come home with a bad back and a flag in a shadow box, and raised a son who had needed it, turned out considerably longer than expected to understand what that quietly, completely amounted to. Harrington looked at the photograph every morning. Every morning, he understood his father a little better. On a Thursday in April, 6 months and 11 days after the gala, he sat down at the metal desk in his quarters and wrote a letter. Not the formal apology he had delivered through Admiral Steele's office in November, handwritten as required, delivered on schedule, the procedural acknowledgement of institutional consequence. That letter had been correct and necessary, and had said what it needed to say. This one was different. Dear Mr. Deputy Secretary, you told me that night that my father never needed a room to know his name. I've spent 6 months trying to understand what that meant. I think I'm starting to. I found a photograph, him and you, Norfolk, 2009. He never mentioned you. Not once. I used to think that was strange. Now I think it was exactly who he was. I'm not the same person who walked into that ballroom. I'm not sure yet who I'm becoming. But I wanted you to know that I'm listening now. For the first time, maybe. Respectfully, Lieutenant Cole Harrington. He sealed it, addressed it to the office of the Deputy Secretary of Defense through official channels, set it on the outgoing mail stack without telling anyone. 3 weeks later, a reply arrived. No letterhead, no official seal, no signature block or classification header or any of the formal apparatus of institutional correspondence. Just a plain white index card folded once with 6 words in a hand that was steady and unhurried, and had clearly written a great many things across a great many years. Your father would be proud. Keep going. Harrington read it once. He did not read it again. He didn't need to. He folded it carefully and placed it in the frame beside the photograph from Norfolk, his father on the pier, Marcus Webb beside him. 2 men who had understood something about service and dignity, and the difference between performing authority and earning it, that had taken Cole Harrington 27 years and 1 catastrophic evening to begin to grasp. On the flight deck of the USS Kearsarge, 6 months and 11 days after the night, he had put his hand on a stranger's shoulder and decided in the space of one thoughtless moment who that stranger was and what he deserved. Cole Harrington watched the Mediterranean and said nothing. For the first time in his life, the silence felt like enough. The loudest man in that ballroom spent 2 hours telling a quiet man he didn't belong. The quiet man spent 2 hours waiting for the room to catch up with what he already knew. Real authority doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It just walks in, sits down, and waits because it has always known how the story ends. The only question is how long it takes everyone else to figure out they were reading it wrong. If this story made you feel something, drop it in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if you're new here, the subscribe button is right there. We tell stories like this one. Stories that stay with you. Don't miss the next one.